You know, I don't like having nightmares. I really, really don't. They make me wake up with a sense of dread, and I have to wash my sheets because of them, because they're soaked through with sweat and hopefully nothing else. But, however, I'd be lying to you if I said I wasn't a fan of horror. I love it, which is strange to say nightmares, but whatever. But a well-done horror story can be incredibly compelling, and it can stick in your memory sort of like a catchy song. You know, sort of like NIB from Black Sabbath does. And it can be just as horrifying if you pay attention to the lyrics. But anyway, this year, leading up to Halloween, I'm going to be taking you through 4 of my favorite nightmares, leading up to a nice little surprise at the end of the month. Not only are these some of my favorite movies, video games, and story arcs of written media that I've read, they're also some of my inspirations in my writing that I do. Since Englewood is coming to a close, this will serve as a good preview for what comes to all of us at the end of October. This week we'll be discussing one of the best sci-fi horror mixes to ever grace the silver screen, Event Horizon. For those unfamiliar with this film, let me ask you a question. Do you know who the director of those really bad Resident Evil movies is? The guy who did the PG-13 Alien vs. Predator and is now preparing to screw up Monster Hunter? What if I told you that he's actually got a really good movie under his belt? Okay, I'll give you Mortal Kombat, so let's go a step further. What if I told you he's got a great movie under his belt? That's Event Horizon for you. Now, to be fair to Paul W.S. Anderson, the director of this film, every movie he has made since the first Resident Evil has made its money back, and Event Horizon is one of 2 back-to-back box office bombs that he's had. The other one being Soldier, a movie set in the Blade Runner universe where Kurt Russell says barely anything throughout the movie. Yeah, not a winner. However, Event Horizon was a movie that was way ahead of its time. And since the phrase that exists of being ahead of your time is not much different than being behind the times, Event Horizon ends up being a perfect example of that. So, Event Horizon, as a film, was something you don't see very often when it comes to sci-fi or horror, mostly because of how well it manages to mix both of them. Beyond that, the film serves as a mix of both spacefaring horror a la Alien, but also supernatural horror a la The Exorcist. To my recollection, I don't think there's another film that really had tried to properly mix the two together. You wouldn't really think of having a ship that quite literally goes to hell, but here it is, a movie about a spaceship that goes to hell. Now, don't let my summary fool you. The film does have a lot of incredibly strong elements to it that bring the story to life, even though I can describe it rather simplistically. Hell, the cast is phenomenal in and of itself. The score is done by Michael Kamen, who scored classic films like Brazil, Highlander, Lethal Weapon films, the Die Hard films, License to Kill, The Iron Giant, Band of Brothers, and more. The cast features Laurence Fishburne, Sam Neill, Jolie Richardson, Jason Isaacs, who I think should be playing Doctor Doom in the MCU, Kathleen Quinlan, and Sean Pertwee. For those who don't know all of those names, if you look them up, you'll probably find several films you enjoy them in. Plus, if you don't know who Laurence Fishburne or Sam Neill is, I wonder what's wrong with you. So what makes Event Horizon so enticing? Well, first off, the acting is very good, but the cast of the film should make that part of things quite obvious. You've got a cast of a couple of well-known actors, with several others that are simply unsung minor league ones whose talent never really got enough acknowledgement. There are points in the film where it really comes across like the crew are legitimately losing their minds, and that's before the audience or the cast really has any answers, and that's not something you could do without really solid acting talent. To be fair to Paul W.S. Anderson, it's also something you can't really pull off with really good direction either, which I will give him kudos for here. He really directed his butt off for this particular movie, but from all the backstage stuff that I've heard from watching other videos about this particular movie, this was a labor of love for him, and it really shows here. Shows for the whole cast. Now, not to mention, each character has enough development, for the most part, and enough past trauma for the audience to latch onto. sort of the same way that Aliens had the space trucker vibe. These are largely working class people with families and something to lose. They all have their quirks, they all have their idiosyncrasies, and you're able to pick up on it easily. You can't help but feel how they feel. In the end, a horror story lives and dies on its ability to convey the same terror that the cast of the film feels, and Event Horizon pulls it off, and I think pulled it off a lot better than a lot of other horror movies that were coming out at the time. In fact, there are some modern films that I don't think have really even been able to do that in horror very well either, except for maybe a couple of exceptions, one of them being a fellow supernatural horror, The Witch. To give an example from the film, the decompression scene in this is the least gory part of it, and is easily one of the most tense horror sequences I have ever seen. The acting in it is just fantastic. And like I said before, the cast who made this film, every time they've been asked about it, they loved making it. And you can tell, this really was just one big labor of love for all people involved. And those sometimes are the best films you can really get a hold of. The second element that I love about this is that the fusion that I mentioned before is present. The mixture of claustrophobic space-bound horror, sort of like Alien, plus supernatural horror on top of it. Now, space in and of itself isn't that frightening unless you know what explosive decompression is and some of the other nasty stuff out there. What can make a story like this so frightening is a very common phobia: claustrophobia. Spaceships and stories like these aren't big and sprawling very often, unless it's a space opera or something along those lines, and this certainly is not one of those. Even though the Event Horizon seems sizable and is shaped like a giant crucifix, the sets never really feel that big, and gives the idea that the ship was more built to house a giant engine rather than it was to house a bunch of people. That's why its size is the way that it is. The actual crew areas are not very big at all because they don't need to be, and they need to be sectioned off for certain purposes, or at least that's the vibe you get from ship construction in this particular story. It's basically filled with tech that's used to fold space-time in an experiment to substitute for faster-than-light travel. The real kicker for me is the supernatural element, though. A weird part of being a Christian my whole life, and then later becoming a theology student, gave me this odd fascination with depictions of hell and demonology. Part of the reason I dig a game like Doom or a movie like The Exorcist is that exact reason. Hell is an interesting concept, and many of our perceptions of it come from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance or just Christian theology. You think of stories like the Divine Comedy or Paradise Lost or the Book of Revelation. That's often how we get these perceptions in our culture. The Christian view of hell is one of eternal punishment for any sins committed, and it's often debated on how it would play out. Is it just some big pit of fire that everybody roasts in, or is it something more sinister, a place of true torment, of mind, body, and soul? Well, no one really knows because you can't come back from that, and it's that unknowing that makes it ripe for horror. Your imagination gets to play with you. This concoction of supernatural and spacefaring brings about a lot of unknowns, plus does something that I enjoy in fiction: the idea of scientific curiosity leading to something far more sinister, because you got too curious and now the cat is about to get caught. It's a common point of science fiction, stories like I, Robot, or things along those lines. And hell, it was even a major subplot in Avengers Age of Ultron. You'll probably notice by now that I haven't really talked much about the story itself. Well, the reason for that is I don't want to spoil it for you. I've already given you the basic plot synopsis. I've told you how good the acting is and who the actors involved are, and that's basically all I really need to say. Paul W.S. Anderson just basically unleashes it. I mean, other elements of the story are good. The score, like I mentioned, is just as good as any of the other films that the composer has worked on, if not better. On top of that, it's very good at setting pace. The only real weakness, I think, is, the fact that the money was running out near the end of the production was kind of obvious, especially with some of the sound effects used. There's actually one point where they actually used the door opening from the video game Doom, which Paul W.S. Anderson is a huge fan of. But regardless of all that, if you haven't seen this movie yet, you need to. It was put together in less than a year. And as compelling as it is, And as successful as it has been since its release, because it was a box office bomb, it has actually gotten a huge following afterwards. But the sucky part is it can't have a director's cut, because a lot of the extra footage was sadly lost and corroded. It's a big-time bummer because some of the depictions of hell that were cut alongside other character development parts that would have been kept in sounded incredibly interesting. I would love to see a 2-hour version of this movie. In fact, this is one of the few movies that, even though it's good to start, I wouldn't mind seeing it remade and reshooting that original stuff. Heck, the original cast is still all alive as part of this video and not exactly that old, so why not do it? Not to mention, I think it would be better received now than it was at the start, mostly because this type of horror, especially the supernatural element, is more widely accepted and loved now than it was at the time. You know, you keep in mind the success of the Dead Space franchise with video games, for example, which sold millions upon millions of copies and took obvious inspiration from this particular film. It's one really good example of how the mix of scientific based horror alongside supernatural based horror can be mixed well. Basically, the peanut butter and the chocolate can be used very effectively here. To close this one out, it's unfortunate that Event Horizon wasn't well received when it happened, but it's easily one of my favorite horror stories. Something about the acting, the not knowing about what's real and what isn't, the tension of the storyline, the score, and all of those elements mix something together for something that's really, really great. It's also unfortunate that this was the creative peak of Paul W.S. Anderson's career, but it was one hell of a peak. Pick this movie up sometime, and you won't be disappointed. Also, tune in next week for my next little favorite nightmare as we walk through the fog of Silent Hill 2 together. Until that point, though, my name is Micah Curtis, your favorite vanilla gorilla. I'll see you next time.